My name is Chris Hegarty. I work for Christian Aid, and I'm going to talk about tax as being a key to education for all. I was under the impression that you guys had a choice of where you were going to go for this session, but I understand you're my tax prisoners, tax hostages, and I'll try and be nice to you. It's perhaps not as glamorous or sexy, but I do genuinely believe that if you want to understand why so many children don't have sufficient education, then you do have to look at issues around tax. So, in this session, I'll talk about tax as being the key to education for everyone. So the first thing really is why tax is actually exciting. The second are a series of reasons why there's actually a lot of reason to be optimistic about tax, and things are improving substantially. That gives us reason to be hopeful for the future. But also throughout this discussion, hopefully I'll try and explain what we all based here in Scotland can do about it. Okay, tax. Personally, I've been working on issues around tax for about 8 years now, and Christian Aid has been working on issues around tax for about seven years now. And we talk a lot about tax within Christian Aid. And last week, I got an email from a colleague which said something like, "I love tax, I'm just not in love with tax." And I think what he was trying to get at was that it's not as if we love talking about tax, for the sake of it, but we love what tax can do, what tax can mean for people, and what it can help to bring about, particularly for the world's poorest people, which is obviously the focus of our work. So, tax is actually really exciting. If you think about what tax delivers, schools, health services, roads, basic pensions, police, security, basic unemployment benefits, clean water supply, and a whole lot more. And tax is what funds and supports and enables countries to have all of these things. And I mean, in themselves, some of these things are perhaps not that exciting, but if you think about what life would be like if these things didn't exist, then that's really the situation in some of the poorest countries in the world. So in a wealthy country like Scotland, we have all these things. Political debate really surrounds, which of these things we do a bit more of, or we spend a bit more money on, and which of these things we maybe prioritize a bit less. But in many poorer countries around the world, these things often barely exist at all, and if they do exist, then the quality of them is not that good. And I think this comes to the heart of a discussion that will run through today's conversations, which is whether, if none of these things or very few of these things actually exist, it's much harder to then say that all children have to go to school and that education should get priority over, for example, schools or health services or roads or clean water, for example. Which comes first out of all of these things? And for me, the answer, in the long term at least, is to increase the tax revenues for the poorest countries so that they can be just like Scotland or Denmark or America or Japan or whatever it may be, and they have sufficient tax revenues to support all of these things by themselves, just as we do here. But this money doesn't just come from nowhere. It has to come from somewhere. So where might it come from? And this is a question. I'm not going to use the whole voting button thing. This is really just a show of hands. But I just wonder, how much do you think tax dodging by big multinational companies costs developing countries each year? And if we just do it by a show of hands, so the three options are 10%, the equivalent of 10% of the global aid budget, equivalent of 50% of the total global aid budget, or 3, the equivalent of 1.5 times the entire global total aid budget. So if you think it's 10% of the global aid budget, anyone? There's a few people. If you think it's 50% of the global aid budget, quite a lot more. And if you think it's 1.5 times the entire aid budget, again, quite a few there. So as far as Christian Aid estimates that it's the last one. It's the equivalent of 1.5 times the entire aid budget from the entire planet. And that, to put that into monetary terms, is $160 billion per year, which is equivalent to $32,000 for every single man, woman, and child in Scotland every single year. So the sums of money that cost developing countries by multinationals dodging taxes is absolutely massive. And if we could change that, then all of a sudden you'd have huge amounts of resources for all of the things that we've just talked about in terms of these things: schools, health service, roads, basic pensions, and so on. Now, hopefully, we'll just have what should be filmed now. Christian Aid works very closely with several organisations on this, and this film is from an organisation called Action Aid, and it's about the importance of tax and aid in terms of tackling poverty.
Governments in the poorest countries often don't have enough resources to provide services to all their citizens. So aid is a valuable and vital resource to improve people's lives, but it's not always enough on its own. Sister Florence Mwemba from Mazabuka, Zambia, is in charge of Nakambala Clinic, treating up to 250 patients per day. The clinic receives vital aid donations, but does not receive enough government funding to meet healthcare needs in the region. There is a long-term solution. If poor countries could increase the finance they raise themselves through tax, they can help their citizens long-term. But right now, poor countries are losing money because of massive tax dodging, helped by tax havens around the world. In fact, 98 out of 100 of the largest companies in the UK have registered subsidiaries in tax havens. Poor countries lose 3 times more to tax havens than they receive in aid every year. The irony is, multinationals dodging tax are often from the same rich countries that are providing the aid. The UK and other G20 governments need to take action to tackle tax dodging. For Florence, if the Zambian government could provide extra funding, her clinic would have more trained staff and more vaccines in stock. We're already seeing some poor countries making real progress in strengthening their tax systems. But we still have a long journey ahead, and aid is a vital resource to help poor countries pave the way. With aid and tax justice, poor countries are in a stronger position to tackle poverty and inequality. Governments, take action. Keep your promise on aid and support tax justice.
So that just explains a bit more about the process. But it mentioned multinationals. We're all familiar with multinationals. We buy stuff from them. Many of our friends or parents and family might work for them. But that film introduced the whole role of multinationals. And I just wanted to talk about how this happens. How are these taxes dodged, if you like, by so many multinationals? And to use the example of tax and bananas, this is from a study that Christian Aid did with the Guardian newspaper several years ago. And it looked at, I don't know how well you can see the prices there, the numbers there, but this was a study of if we spend £1 on bananas in a supermarket in the UK, there was analysis of where that money goes and how that money sort of filters through the entire system. And banana production is inherently quite a simple process. It gets grown, usually in a developing country. It gets shipped to the UK, distributed and sold in our supermarkets. It's a relatively simple process. But in terms of this chart here, the main phases are in the bottom left, which is where it's produced in Latin America, and in the very top right, where it's sold and consumed in the UK. But the key here is that multinationals control this entire process from start to finish. And they have subsidiaries. Not all of them. Some of them have subsidiaries set up in all these slightly odd parts of the world, most of which are in jurisdictions or countries where the tax rates are extremely low or even zero. Now, companies pay taxes on profit. So what multinationals can do is hide the profit by choosing where this profit shows up within this process. And so they choose for profits to appear in those jurisdictions, those places which have either zero or very low tax rates, and therefore they can avoid paying tax. So if we look at this example here, the bottom left is where it's grown and produced in the developing country, and only 13 pence is there, but there's only one pence of taxable profits there, which is virtually nothing in terms of tax going to the developing country. Similarly, if you look at the top right here, it's consumed in the UK. Only 1 penny of taxable profit is attributed to the UK. So again, in the UK, even they're dodging taxes here as well. And this whole sort of this slightly very opaque, very messy bit in between is the multinational making use of subsidiaries based in what are often called tax havens to sort of park parts of their activity. So we look at where these things are. Bermuda for a distribution network, Isle of Man for insurance services, In Ireland, it was charged for the use of brand. Luxembourg, 8p for financial services. Jersey, 6p for financial services. Cayman Islands, 8p for use of purchasing networks. These things don't exist in the Cayman Islands or Luxembourg or Jersey. Virtually nothing happens there other than a bookkeeping and accounting transaction, which means that the profit accrues in these countries rather than the countries where it should be payable. In other words, in the developing country where it's grown and in the UK where it's sold. So this is roughly how it can happen. And as I say, the key to it is that multinational controls the whole process from start to finish. So what is Christian Aid calling for? As that slide shows, the problem here is that it's not transparent. It's so difficult to find out where the money is going and why it's going there and all this. So what we're actually calling for is a much more transparent system. There's much more detail, there's much more scrutiny, and there's an end to tax secrecy, which would really tackle a lot of the tax havens that are at the root of the problem. But just thinking about this from a company, a multinational's perspective, this is from the UK Companies Act, so this is as it applies in the UK. What must a company legally do? And it says in the UK Companies Act 2006, the director of a company must promote the success of the company for the benefit of its shareholders. So arguably, all a multinational is doing here is doing kind of what it's expected to do, which is to try and maximize its profit, hide as much tax as possible so it can maximize its profit. And so to a large extent, it's a question of how can those big multinationals be influenced to change the way in which they operate, to do the right thing instead of hiding these taxes. So it's another question for you. This isn't, again, I'm not going to use the voting buttons, but another question for you. If we want massive multinational PLC to operate in the interests of poor people, which of these groups do you think we should try and influence first? First of all, again, I'll do show of hands afterwards, but the three options are massive multinationals customers, massive multinationals shareholders, or the politicians and governments who set the rules by which this company has to operate. So which of you think, just a show of hands, does anyone think the first group we should concentrate on are massive multinationals customers? There's quite a few. Secondly, massive multinationals shareholders. Okay. Still not that many. And thirdly, politicians and governments that set the rules by which companies have to operate. Okay, that's interesting. So I'd say the majority of people went for option 3 there. And for Christian Aid's perspective, there's no right or wrong answer to that question. And in fact, we do all 3. So we work with customers, we work with shareholders, and we certainly work with politicians and governments to try and change the whole process. And I'll go through each of these groups, customers, shareholders, and politicians and governments, to show just briefly what we're doing or what kind of thing we're doing on each of these 3 categories. And like I said at the start, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. There's been huge change in the way in which tax is perceived by people in the UK, by the media coverage of it, and also by the political response to it over the past few years. And this is borne out in stats like this. So the first reason for optimism, customers. Over half of Scots are considering boycotting companies that avoid tax. And over 2 in every 5, 41% say that, of Scots say that they're already doing so. So I wonder, can anyone name any companies that they've heard of that are associated with not paying enough tax? Go and just shout them out. Starbucks is one. Amazon. Anyone else? Google? Yeah. There's a few others. Vodafone's mentioned too. There's been a huge amount of press coverage recently about companies and whether they pay taxes. And often, we talk about Amazon, Google, Starbucks, Vodafone. These are consumer companies. These are companies that depend upon their brand and being seen as being good guys for people like us to buy their products. So the brand is incredibly important to them. And customers can have a huge impact by changing their behavior. So people can, first of all, boycott their products, but they can also get in touch with the company and say, why they're doing so. The second grouping is shareholders, and another reason for optimism. Interest in working with shareholders to try and improve not just the financial performance of a company, but the ethical performance of a company is growing. And this chart just shows the growth in what are called so-called ethical funds in the UK. So Christian Aid is already working with investors, both here in Scotland, mainly in Edinburgh, and in London. And there's a lot of interest from shareholders to say, look, our customers are coming to us. And again, it comes back to customers who are approaching the big investment companies to say, look, we're concerned about these kinds of things. What are you doing about it? And they're getting in touch with the big companies, the multinationals, to say, look, we think you should do this slightly differently. So we're already working with big pension funds. And again, it's something that you can get involved in if, I guess, you don't have pension funds at the moment, but your parents or friends might have pension funds. And it's very easy to get in touch with the companies that provide those pension funds and ask them, what are you doing about the way in which companies pay their tax or don't pay their tax in developing countries? And the third group that most of you thought we should tackle first is politicians and governments. And it's maybe a wee bit jarring for some people to see a picture of George Osborne under the title Reason for Optimism. But George Osborne represents, he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's a Conservative Chancellor. And perhaps surprisingly, he and David Cameron and many others have really woken up and started taking this issue very, very seriously. So back in February, George Osborne wrote, "We are determined to drive a serious debate on tax evasion and tax avoidance. This will include action to help developing countries collect tax that is due to them." Now that was the result of a huge amount of work by Christian Aid, but also by its supporters, people who help it, and other organisations like Action Aid that I mentioned earlier, to put this onto the agenda, to explain the problem to people like George Osborne, and to get him to take this seriously. And then what we've seen over the course of the summer, there was the G8 meeting in Northern Ireland in June, at which tax and international development, tax and how it is the key to unlocking aspects of poverty, was right at the heart of the agenda within the G8 in Northern Ireland. And that's largely down to pressure from organisations like Christian Aid and others. So, to conclude, I've tried to explain why and how tax plays a crucial role in expanding access to education. It's a huge barrier that, if we can get around, can have incredible benefits. And like I said, there's a whole series of reasons to be optimistic. But I think, as I've tried to say throughout, it really is dependent upon people like yourself being empowered to take action as a customer, as a shareholder, as someone who can lobby their politicians to help continue to make this happen. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take a few minutes of questions if anyone has any. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? I don't think we'll use roving mics. We've just got a couple of minutes. If you don't have any, that's fine. But there's one over there to kick us off.
Yeah, why should organisations like Amazon, the ones you mentioned, change within the law?
I'm sorry, what?
If they're within the law, why should they change what they're doing?
There was an interesting example of that. There's a committee within the House of Commons which scrutinises these things, the Public Accounts Committee. And what the chairperson, the chairwoman of the committee said, we're not saying you're being illegal, we're saying you're being immoral. So, I mean, I think the companies will try and argue that this is, they're just about acting within the law here. But, when you work for an organisation like mine, which sees the effects of companies dodging these taxes on the poorest countries, and we're talking about education today, I mean, it's just one example of where the consequences of dodging taxes manifest itself, where it's very obvious. Then I think there are serious questions of ethics about whether it's right to dodge taxes in some of the countries that Christian Aid works in. And it goes back to the three groupings that we talked about. I mean, if enough customers are sufficiently bothered by the fact that company X avoids taxes in developing countries, then they'll change that. If enough shareholders put enough pressure on companies to behave in a different way, that can change. But also, I think most people here talked about the way to tackle this is to change the rules, the rules for companies at political level. So that's perhaps the thing that we've put most emphasis on, is changing the rules so that companies don't have that excuse, if you like. So they absolutely have to be much more transparent and open and pay the taxes where they should pay them. There were one or two other questions. Girl at the back with the blazer. I mean, I don't know if I share the view. Do you think? I don't know if you're aware of the outcry around about Starbucks, for example, about the fact they haven't paid their taxes, and as a result of that, Starbucks have started to pay tax in the UK. I mean, that's a slightly different thing because it's about paying tax in the UK. But I think, particularly the companies that have that place a lot of emphasis on their brand as being seen as being a kind of nice, warm and fluffy brand, if there's a spotlight shone on them to say, look, these guys are doing things which cause terrible suffering in developing countries, then I do think they start to have to care about what you might call moral issues as opposed to just business issues, because it becomes a business issue at that point. If there's a boycott and people start losing, and it goes back to the slide about however many 40% of Scots already boycotting companies that they perceive as being dodging taxes. That's a very big business problem for them too. And I'll take one more question, I think, which there's a girl just in front of the last question. Thanks. Yes, there is a danger. It's very perceptive, and it's absolutely right. But that's why it's absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest things that organisations like Christian Aid and Action Aid and others who are focusing on this issue is to bring to light the issue of tax dodging in general, but specifically to explain to people. It's kind of why I'm here today, is to try and explain to people why there's also that impact on developing countries and why we think that's really important as well. Because I think you're right, otherwise it can very quickly be swallowed up as a kind of UK-focused problem where they're not paying enough tax in a UK context. But for me, even the bigger issue than that is what they're not paying in developing countries. And I think, as you said as well, we've got a system here. If you think of how big the tax collection system is in the UK and how well-resourced and well-funded that is, and you compare that to the tax collection systems in Zambia or Ghana or wherever it may be, I mean, they've got a tiny fraction of the number of people that we have in the UK. So I think we actually say that, it's a much bigger problem there than it is here. Now, I think that's pretty much it. One more question? Quick question? Sorry, down the front.
You're talking about taxes from big businesses and stuff. What about taxes from people who don't have much money anyway?
People who don't what, sorry? Yeah, I mean, I think so. The question was, we're talking about tax from big business. What about taxes that could be paid or should be paid by people who individuals, some of whom may not have that much? And I mean, taxes from multinationals make up a relatively small proportion of total tax in the UK. So in the UK, a lot of tax, the biggest single contribution towards tax comes from income tax, which is, in other words, what we pay on our wages and salaries. But in developing countries, precisely because the economies are so small, relatively poor, that a lot of individuals just don't have that much to contribute. So actually, in proportionate terms, the tax that could come from multinationals is absolutely massive, and it could have sort of completely overwhelming changes to the system if we could just get some of the multinationals that we're familiar with here to pay the proper taxes in developing countries. The amount of change that could happen very quickly is actually very substantial. But you're right. Ideally, we get to a point where the economies are much bigger, and these countries can have much bigger contributions from their own employees rather. Now, I better finish. Thank you very much. Lots of great questions. Thank you very much.